You know, I've been an activist for many years in Israel. I'm getting in front of bulldozers because I'm the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, fighting the occupation. And over the years, as I've been on the ground, getting kicked by Israeli soldiers and this and that, the question in the back of my mind, kind of nagging me in the back of my mind, was always, how does Israel get away with this? You know, here we have a conflict. I mean, one of the major conflicts in the world disrupts the entire Middle East. It's happening in the southern border of Europe in the light of day. It's not happening in the faraway mountains somewhere. In the Holy Land, no less, just to give it an added twist. You know, supported by the United States and Europe, involving major weapon systems, you know, with a degree of violence, especially over Gaza, for example, and occasional wars, you know, that are major wars really in any context. And yet, and Israel is an occupying power of the last 50 years, and yet the Israeli status in the international community gets better and better all the time. Every successive president loves Israel more, gives more money to Israel. Now we're up to $38 billion over a 10-year period for arms from the United States. And internationally, Israel's reputation gets better and better. You know, just a few years ago, Israel was voted in to the OECD, which is the club of the exclusive advanced economies of the world. At that time, there were 25 members. To become a member, not only did you have to have a certain level of economic development and stability, but you had to adhere to human rights standards and to international law. To get into the OECD, it has to be a unanimous vote among the 25 most advanced economies in the world. And Israel was voted in. You know, with an occupation, with everything else we're talking about, was voted in, even by countries like Norway and Ireland that are otherwise, you know, very critical of Israel. So one question is why? That's one question. Another question is, you know, we have here the map of what we call the two-state solution. That was a solution for many years to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as it's called. And it's obviously a very pro-Israeli solution. And this is the political solution supported by the United States and the international community, in which Israel is on 78% of historic Palestine. Even though the Jews today are a minority in this country, and the Palestinians, the indigenous majority population, are confined to, or would have gotten, maybe, under this idea, a little state on 22% of their historic homeland. You know, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. So, in 1988, the PLO under Arafat officially recognized Israel in these borders and said to Israel, we will normalize relations with you, us and the entire Arab world and everybody else, if you give up the occupation. Now you would expect Israel to grab that opportunity. Whoa, we're a minority population, and yet we could get 78% of the country. And peace, and security, and the recognition of the entire Arab world. If we give up, all right, we give up Tulkarm, we give up Jericho, we give up Hebron, for not much of a price, Gaza, we could have peace, security, and 78% of the country 30 years ago. Can you imagine if this had been resolved 30 years ago, how that might have impacted on the Middle East of today? Why didn't Israel grab that opportunity? Well, these are all kinds of questions that are hard to answer unless you understand what I call Israel's security politics. And that is that we have to look at the West Bank and Gaza, the Palestinian areas, as a resource, not as a threat, not as an occupied territory, because Israel denies it's an occupied territory, but rather as a place where you can, and it's harsh to say this, but it's true, where you can test and develop weapons for a kind of a war that I call war against the people, that is then for exporting. And I want to go back and I want to explain what that means, and then I think we'll begin to understand why Israel isn't interested in giving up the occupied territories, that resource, and why Israel gets away with it in the world. So all right, so look, I'm looking, in other words, what we were doing always was looking down at Israel and the occupation. So to answer these questions, I said to myself, what if I looked up at Israel's place in the world? And if you look up, all of a sudden a whole different kind of a picture begins to emerge of this little country called Israel, a country the size of Connecticut. And Israel, it turns out, becomes a major arms and security power in the world. So what you can do, this is only a partial map, what you can do is explain Israel's relations to virtually every single country in the world, including countries it does not have diplomatic relations with. And there's technologies, but especially police technologies, what I call technologies of repression, surveillance systems, different kinds of security systems. It isn't only military. And you look at the map, and we're used to thinking of Israel as a client state of the U.S. And certainly there's a lot of relationships, and you love Israel, you Americans. I mean, Israel's your best ally in the Middle East, and we share values. And every 2 weeks you have an Israeli prime minister addressing Congress, and Israel, Israel, Israel. Well, you look at the map, and some interesting things emerge from this security politics. Israel is not in your basket. Or how would you say, all Israel's eggs are not in the American basket, by any means. Look, turns out Israel is the number 2 arms supplier to China. Whoa. I mean, China is the arch enemy of the United States. The United States is moving the entire 6th Fleet into the South Pacific to contain China. John Bolton, one of your stellar diplomats, was in Israel a couple weeks ago. And he said, and I'm serious, he said this, if Trump ever found out how close Israel is to China, he'd be very upset. Fortunately, he's not going to find out. But, so in other words, here's Israel as the number 2 arms supplier to China after Russia, and what makes it more impressive is that Israel's not selling big, expensive equipment. Jet airplanes and ships and missiles and tanks, that would account for that volume of business. It's selling components of weapon systems, surveillance systems, so that if Israel can be the number 2 arms supplier to China with the largest army in the world, and it's only selling smaller things, it gives you the idea of how deep the penetration is of Israel into not only the military in China, but into the security services and the police and other realms. Israel, it turns out, is it depends on the year, 2, 3, 4 largest arms supplier to India. These are 2 of the largest militaries in the world. Plus, all kinds of things. Now with Bolsonaro in Brazil, Israel has agreed to send drones to the police forces, not to the army, with facial recognition systems, weaponized drones for pacification of the favelas, and in Bolsonaro's regime, pacification of everybody, I'm sure. And you can go all over the world. Look, 25% of Israel's arms deals are with Sub-Saharan Africa. Europe, of course, is very important. Canada. The point I'm trying to make is that Israel, you can look at Israel in every single country and document exactly how it helps the elites in that country and the governments in that country repress and control their populations, including, of course, one of the most dramatic cases is Saudi Arabia. And the Khashoggi family, the journalist who was killed in Istanbul, his family is suing Israel and an Israeli security firm for selling the eavesdropping equipment to the Saudi government with which they caught the journalist. So that Israel is, Sisi in Egypt has just said last week that, how deep the Israeli involvement is in the security of Egypt. So you can go country by country. I mean, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Myanmar, there's a worldwide boycott of weaponry, a UN boycott of weapons to Myanmar, and Israel is the only country that is bypassing that boycott. Israel has 2 military bases, one off Eritrea, both in Muslim countries. One off Eritrea, but the most important one in Azerbaijan. And this is where Israel launches its rockets into space for satellites and so on. And that's significant because this is the jumping off point to Iran. You see? Now, I would even go so far as to say, and I'm being provocative and maybe overstating the case, that in many ways Israel has a greater global reach than the United States. Now, that seems crazy. The Pentagon's budget is $1 trillion a year. You have bases in 174 countries out of 193. How could that be? Well, the American presence is a military one. You've got bases all over, but they're fairly closed areas, kind of McDonald's lands. You eat McDonald's and then you fly your airplanes out somewhere. And their impact on a society is fairly shallow, fairly limited. Whereas Israel doesn't have bases. I mean, it has those 2. It doesn't have bases, but Israel works not only with your military, it works primarily with your security services, your presidential guards, your internal domestic security, homeland security, and your police forces. You see, and with your corporations. So in a way, in almost every country, the Israeli penetration deep into the security realms of a country is much deeper than that of the United States. So Israel really is a presence to be dealt with, but there's another level to all this too. I mean, this is kind of straightforward. You sell arms to governments that repress their populations. That's nothing really new. But war against the people has another meaning. And that is, I put it within the framework of global capitalism. We all live, this is sort of the map of intersectionality in a way. We all live in one capitalist system. It doesn't matter where you are, who you are, we're all within this system. It's sort of the common, I don't know if you want to say the common enemy, but it's the common situation we live in. Well, the capitalist system certainly, over the last 50 years, as neoliberalism, this predatory, unregulated neoliberalism grows, is closing down. I mean, the happy face of Ronald McDonald and Hollywood, where capitalism liked to co-opt people and bring them in, is really becoming transformed and has a much more violent and repressive nature today. Corporate control. of the global economy is much greater than it ever was. And we don't have a Teddy Roosevelt anymore to bust monopolies. We've gotten to a point where governments are really working for corporations. And corporations have more resources than most governments. I mean, Jeff Bezos himself has more money than probably any other country except the United States and maybe Britain. And it's true, in the Occupy movement, we used to say we're the 99%. That's pretty much literally the case. Oxfam came out with a report last year that 1% of the world's population owns 50% of the world's resources. And of course, the control the corporations have. At the same time, in a church, how's this for a theological concept? Surplus humanity, which is a term that corporations use. 80% of the world's population lives on less than $10 a day. And they're surplus, they're superfluous, because they'll never be really educated in a meaningful way. They're not going to be skilled workers. And worst of all, they'll never be consumers. You can't buy much on $10 a day. So they're really kind of superfluous to the world's economy. And this, of course, is a picture of the Global South, but the Global South is more and more coming into the Global North. This is from the Occupy Wall Street movement. So our kids, I mean, those of us that are of our age or a little bit younger, our kids do not have the prospects of achieving our standards of living in terms of housing, in terms of jobs, in terms of job security, so that the Global South is penetrating greatly into the Global North. And as that happens, there's more and more resistance on all kinds, from demonstrations to insurgencies to other things. And wars today reflect that. Wars today are resource wars. They're not wars of ideologies and armies and countries and tanks and battles. These are the areas, especially this belt around the equator, where the world's most valuable resources are found. And these happen to be some of the poorest countries in the world. So that, we're in the process of robbing the resources of these countries, turning the people into either surplus humanity or at best cheap labor, and at the same time, of course, destroying the planet. Because unregulated capitalism has that potential of it's creating climate change and everything else we know. So, in this situation then, you have what's called, there's a geographer named Derek Gregory in Canada who calls it the everywhere war. I call it a war against the people, or you might call it a securocratic war, because the point of the war against the people is to secure the world for corporations, basically. It's securocratic in the sense of securing, on the one hand, you're securing people against an uprising, and securing going the other way means you're pacifying populations. You're pacifying populations so that they can't resist. That's securitization. So these are securocratic wars in battle space. The militaries today reflect this, their language. You've heard this all the time. Police are today referred to as warriors. Just like soldiers are considered warriors. You don't have soldiers and police so much anymore. You've got these common terms. And battle space is a term that's used more and more, both by militaries and by police forces. Because the idea is there's no more battlefields. That's an old concept. Battle space means you go wherever there's a challenge to the global system or there's a challenge to your government. It could be Brooklyn, a battle space. It could be North Dakota. It could be India, anywhere where there's a challenge is battle space. And you have to then develop weaponry and tactics not geared to fighting a war with another country, geared to fighting the people in an everywhere war in battle space. And these are the kinds, and the basic goal is, in the end, to enforce the hegemony of the ruling classes. So, you know, that's in a sense the context in which war against the people and Israel, I'll come back to Israel in a second, are operating. And just in case you don't get it, I mean, this is a Pentagon map of the world. I mean, the world's divided into commands. The North American command, the European command, the African command. In other words, this is the way the Pentagon, at least, sees the world. So wars are changing. These wars against the people. And it's interesting. We think of war in, Patton, World War II ways, battles and tanks and wars. Here you have a new F-35 that the Pentagon's produced for $1 trillion. But those kinds of conventional interstate wars are pretty much gone. The last major interstate war that involved two or more powers was the Korean War. And I'm not sure if China in those days was considered a major power. You might go back to World War II, even. Since that time, there's been some localized wars between countries. Iran-Iraq, the Falklands War, which was a cute war, Arab-Israeli wars, Russia and Georgia, so on. But those were all, some of them were very deadly, but they were localized and didn't have that global impact. So and certainly didn't involve the kinds of weaponry that the Pentagon is producing. So these kinds of wars are pretty much gone. So what we have today are what I call securocratic wars against the people. And there are two major types. One of them is, asymmetric wars. That's a term that you probably heard. That's used fairly common. Asymmetrical warfare. Well, abroad, in the global south in particular, you've got all these kinds of wars. There's all kinds of terms for them. High-intensity operations. Many wars today are operations and not wars. Partly because Congress, or in different countries, Parliament, you have to declare a war in order for there to be a war. So that needs formal approval. But more so, if you have a war, then the laws of war obtain. And you have to fight by certain rules. You have to have prisoners of war, and they have rights, and you're limited in what you can conquer, what you can do with a conquered territory. There's all kinds of rules of war, rules of engagement. Well, if you're fighting an operation, you're free. You don't have to follow those kinds of wars. So you have Operation Desert Storm. Sometimes we call it the Gulf War, but the official title was an Operation Desert Storm. And that's why the United States could take all these people from Al-Qaeda and other groups and put them in Guantanamo or other places and call them, they called them enemy non-combatants. They invented it. There is no such thing as a non-combatant that you can hold, because you can't hold a civilian. That's a non-combatant. So they called them enemy. They try to say they're military enemies, but they're not combatants, so we don't have to follow the rules of lawfare. Those are the kinds of things you can do under operations, and of course, since terrorism is your goal now, fighting terrorism and so on, you want that flexibility. You've got limited wars, hybrid wars, small wars, irregular wars. Another nice concept that you hear coming out of Iraq was military operations other than war. See, that free you from international laws. Civil wars infiltrate conflicts, of course, but also and police operations. So armies today aren't fighting wars, armies are policing. So you get on the one hand military police, and you get politicized militaries. You know, counterinsurgency, of course, we hear all the time. Low-intensity conflicts, dirty wars. I mean, Jeremy Scahill wrote his book about dirty wars, and all kinds of other wars like that. Those are wars against the people. They're wars against enemies, you might say. They don't have armies. They're not wars against countries. And they're wars that have mainly economic reasons. Again, Bolton, Bolton is kind of a loose cannon. And he said, if you remember, like 2 weeks ago or so, 2-3 weeks ago, that the reason the United States sponsored the coup in Venezuela was because of the oil. I mean, he was very upfront about it. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, and that's why we wanted to do this coup. So that, you know, underneath these kinds of operations are the corporate economic interests at play. And that's why they're wars against the people rather than governments. And then you've got asymmetrical wars at home. So you've got all of a sudden homeland security. That was never a concept in the United States. Even the concept homeland isn't a concept that was used before 9/11. So now after 9/11 you have homeland security. And you know, it's interesting that the Patriot Act was enacted like within a month of 9/11. You know, so it was in the drawer. So these are all kinds of ways through homeland security that you can begin to inaugurate what we call a security state. A state in which security dominates all other aspects of life. And the Patriot Act paved the way for something like that. And there you have counterterrorism. And think of the metaphors. War on crime. War on drugs. War on immigration. I mean, these are kinds of, the terms that are used of wars. And you get states of permanent emergency. The United States has been in a state of emergency since 9/11. People don't always know that, but it's true. And the police and law enforcement officials have authority now that they never had, that the Americans would not have agreed to before 9/11. France is in a state of permanent emergency. And it's a permanent emergency until they actually amend their constitution to give more power to the Ministry of Security and to the policing. So that this is all a part of it, down to actual policing, militarized policing. I mean, we're all aware of the militarized police in the United States. And of course, the whole prison industry as well. So these are the forms of non-conventional war in global battle space that are fought against the people. Okay. In this kind of a system then, now we come back to this map, Israel plays a particular role. I'm not saying it's the only player by any means. I mean, a lot of other countries know how to repress populations and have technologies of repression and police that are repressive. Israel didn't invent the LAPD, you know. But as I'm saying, in this war against the people, Israel is particularly well placed as kind of a go-to state because it's been fighting a war against the Palestinian people for the last 125 years. The United States has been busy defending itself against Russia or against the Soviet Union. Europe hasn't fought colonial wars for 70, 80 years now. So the only really major industrial country with sophisticated armaments that is geared towards fighting wars against the people, that has the proper weapons, the proper tactics, the proper structures, I'll talk about that in a minute, is Israel. And so Israel has become this kind of the go-to country for countries all over the world And this is what I'm trying to say, as the enforcer of global capitalism to some degree. A key tenet of Zionism was always link your wagon to the biggest powers. You know, Theodor Herzl began with the German Kaiser. He went to tried to get the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire involved. After World War I, of course, Zionism linked itself to Britain, the Balfour Declaration and all of that. After 1948, it linked itself to France. France is the country that helped Israel develop its nuclear capability. And remember, Israel attacked Egypt together with France and England. After 1967, it became the United States. But that might not be the end of the story, because as the United States starts to decline, Israel could easily jump ship to China. In other words, Israel's eggs are in many different baskets. So, you know, and then you begin to understand how Israel gets away with it. This is what I call security politics. How you parlay your military security prowess into political clout. And without the occupation, without the ability to develop these weapons in this kind of a laboratory, you know, Israel would be New Zealand. It'd be some little country, be nice to visit. It certainly wouldn't be the fourth largest nuclear power in the world. It wouldn't be in the neighborhood of NATO. It wouldn't be a military ally of the United States. But it's and so the other question, why didn't Israel give up the occupation, I truly believe is partly because it's such a valuable resource. Not only economically, and we have to understand that high tech, all that it comes out of the military. That's the basis of the Israeli economy. But beyond that, it buys you political clout. So Israel's able to sit at the table with the big boys because of its military political clout. And it believes then, you know, because it has its own bottom line, Israel. It wants to keep the occupied territories. It wants to keep the whole country. So Israel believes that by making itself so valuable to the powers of the world that in the end they might criticize the occupation, but they'll never sanction Israel. And as long as Israel isn't sanctioned, it doesn't care. So you can have the Security Council vote against settlements. Remember at the last days of the Obama administration where the United States abstained for the first time. And it passed. But it passed without any sanctions. See, that was the trick. So Israel says, fine, we don't care about that. As a matter of fact, it's even good if you criticize us because it makes it look like we're the victims and we're being attacked, and it actually helps our PR to be attacked by the UN because we're more popular than the UN is. But at the same time, that security politics explains Israel's role in the world. Now, in addition to that, and this is what I try to get into in my book, Israel provides a very useful window into this whole world of the military, security, policing, global capitalism, pacification, all these sorts of things. And one reason why I wrote the book is because this is not on the agenda of the left. I mean, I wrote a book, to tell you the truth, I wrote a book about something I know nothing about. I couldn't tell you a grenade from a tank. You know, I'm not interested in it, it's not my field. But I discovered, first of all, living in Israel, having these questions, I sort of had to begin to follow the threads out. So I began to see that I'm missing something kind of significant here. But beyond that, I discovered that if you take the military and internal security and policing as one unit, one package, which it is today, globally, it's a $2.5 trillion a year industry. And I'm saying to myself, I don't know, I want to change the world, make it a better place. and I don't know anything about a $2.5 trillion a year industry, that's kind of a big blind spot. In addition to that, not knowing weapon systems, not knowing technologies is very dangerous. Most of us in the left, I'll venture to say this, maybe in this room, most of us in the left, liberal left, progressives, whatever we call ourselves, I'm sure most of us, not all of us, most of us come from the humanities, the social sciences, or the arts. We have no idea what these mad 20-year-old scientists are cooking up in Carnegie Mellon with their trillion-dollar budgets. You know, and at the same time, those kids who are at the cutting edge of these technologies that are deadly, that we don't know about, have never studied ethics, they've never studied history, they've never studied philosophy. They're very happy in their with their toys in their laboratories, producing these kinds of weapon systems with no critical thinking, and we're not talking to each other. So we don't know what they're producing against us, and they don't know why that should be a problem. So that I think looking at Israel, that's very sophisticated in its military security technologies, but is a small country and has to scramble in order to sell its products and so on, becomes a very useful window for getting into some of those technologies and educating us. As this shows, Israel has kind of a pivotal position, even more than the United States. Hybrid warfare, which is another word for war against the people, combines conventional warfare with asymmetrical warfare. So Israel has relations with all the major powers. It's in the NATO neighborhood, and it's, of course, an official ally of the United States. But also Israel gets all the way down, like I said, to local headmen in countries that the United States has never heard of. Equatorial Guinea, and even drug cartels. In the civil war in Colombia a few years ago, Israeli mercenaries were training the Colombian army and the paramilitaries and the drug cartels. And they were often battles in which you had Israelis involved on all sides. Israel is very sophisticated in its high-tech weapons, but, unlike the United States, your weapons are so gadgety and sophisticated that your soldiers don't know how to use them. You've got soldiers from, high school graduates, from poor backgrounds that simply don't know how to use the weapons. And most soldiers in the world are child soldiers, soldiers that don't have much of an education. So what Israel specializes in is simplifying weapon systems, making them field-friendly that anybody can use, like the Uzi is the best example, which is almost 2 pieces of metal. There's nothing you could do to mess up an Uzi. That keeps the high-tech or the capacity of the weapons intact, but makes them much more usable for soldiers, including American soldiers, actually. And Israel has experience in conventional warfare. It's fought 5 conventional wars with Arab countries, but also, of course, it's got this century experience of warfare amongst the people. So it's in a very interesting pivotal position. Let me just give you some examples of technologies, because these are things we should know. I'm not going to spend too much time, I promise, but just to dip into this world a little bit. Drones. Israel is the world's leader in the manufacture of drones. 60% of the drones that are made and sold are Israeli. And even the American drones are really Israeli drones that have been kind of souped up by the American military. And most drones today are sold to police forces, not to militaries. That's something that should kind of give us pause, especially because more and more drones are being weaponized. Why Israel? Why are they the leader in drones? Well, it gets us into this war against the people idea. Drone technology has been known from the 1950s and 60s even. The United States wasn't interested in drones because drones are easy to shoot down. What does a drone do? A drone hangs in the sky. That's the whole point of it. It hangs there, and takes pictures. And, it has the ability to patrol in a way human beings can't. You can sit there and be vigilant for days and weeks and months. So that's what it does. That's what a drone basically does. Well, they're easy to shoot down in a conventional war. I mean, it's a sitting duck. So the Americans said, why would we put money into an airplane that you can shoot down? That's stupid. Well, Israel was involved in a war against the people, against Palestinians, against Hezbollah, and so on, even the Egyptians. Well, they didn't have air forces. They didn't have the ability to shoot these airplanes down like Russia has or other countries. So the drones, from a point of view of war against the people, are perfect weapons because they hang there and they're like, a high observation. And now, they're being weaponized more and more, but but you can't reach them. You can't shoot up in the sky if you don't have an air force and reach them. So the reason Israel got into drones and not the United States is because the kind of warfare it was fighting was war against the people and not wars against an air force. So we can begin to see how these concepts begin to affect weaponry. All right, I won't get into all of this. Walls. That's another Israeli. Israel is the world's expert on walls and securitized borders is a better way to put it. Because it's not always walls. And the wall that Trump wants to build with Mexico is not there is a wall. That's the stupid part of it. But the other part of it is it's Elbit Systems, which is an Israeli company, and Boeing out of Seattle. Those are the companies that are doing the sensors. It's a smart fence. That's why, and actually the Democrats are arguing that. They're just not being very clear about it. You don't need a wall. You have technologies today that are more effective than a wall. You even have sensors that don't only detect movement, they can trigger automized weaponry. You have autonomous weapon systems. You don't even need soldiers there. There's all kinds of systems, partly that Israel's developed because Israel does have walls. It has a wall actually for another reason. The wall in Israel is to make a border that you didn't need in the United States. But Israel also specializes in securitized borders. So you've got in Europe, these are the borders in Europe, most of which have been built by or with Israeli companies. I'll give you one little example. Greece has a left-wing government, the government of Tsipras. It's not even a liberal, it's supposed to be a left-wing government. Well, Tsipras has been to Israel several times in order to buy equipment for securitizing the border against Turkey. Partly against Turkey, but mainly because of the refugees that come through Turkey. So the securitized borders, and look, here are the securitized borders in the rest of the world. So securitized borders become a very important part of global securitization. The Pentagon has a map of basically the global north and the global south. And what it says is the global north has to firewall itself off against the global south. Because the global south, besides minerals and resources, is the source, according to the Pentagon, of terrorism, of pandemics, and of criminal activities. So the global north has to, if you look at the map of the global north and the borders really conform to that. You can put these borders onto a map, and a lot of them you begin to see how the global north has fortified itself into kind of a fortress against the global south. So these borders have global meaning, not only local meaning in terms of particular conflicts or borders. And again, Israel is one of the world's leaders in smart fences and in autonomous weapon systems. For example, this is a system called Spy and Shoot that's deployed along the border with Gaza. Now, in this particular case, it's an outpost with a gun, and it's manned by soldiers in Tel Aviv, on screens. So they patrol and they can shoot somebody from Tel Aviv. What's interesting, it's very interesting, in most of the drone and remote sites in the Israeli army, they're manned by women and not by men. And I think there's a philosophy behind it. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it's a very... women are seen as being able to handle the trauma somehow better than men. I don't quite understand it, but that's interesting. At any rate, this is the system, but Israel is also pioneering autonomous weapon systems. This is the new cutting-edge part of warfare, and that is weapons that run by algorithms. You're doing this now with drones. So, for example, you put an algorithm that says the enemy wears a beard, dresses in a white gown, drives white pickup trucks, and is usually in a group of 10 or more people. All right, that's the algorithm, and every time a drone flies over Afghanistan, it attacks a wedding party because it fits the algorithm. So more and more you're getting security systems using algorithms. Today, there's still surveillance systems. And there are cities in the world that are buying Israeli surveillance systems. They're still illegal in terms of weapons. International law does not allow autonomous weapon systems because there's no accountability. But Israel is trying to change that. So that, and there's sort of a rule that if there's a technology, it's going to be applied, no matter what the rules are. So this is another kind of a threat that faces us. And of course, Israel is one of the world's leaders in security because it's got 600 checkpoints in the West Bank. Talk about a direct example of Palestinians as guinea pigs. You've got 600 checkpoints, millions of Palestinians passing every day to school, to shop, to work. And they're all manned by Israeli security companies. No wonder Israel's the world's leader in biometrics and facial recognition. Now those systems are selling to Brazil, for example. Or chips, or different kinds of magnetic devices for surveillance. And no wonder Israel's securing your airports. Israel just signed a contract to secure LAX. And not only LAX. So that here you've got a situation where, despite the American security companies that exist and the technologies, Israel, again, has a system that's much more efficient because it really comes out of the security thing on the ground rather than simply laboratories from some company in Texas. And Israel has these surveillance systems that are being used more and more. Glasgow just bought this kind of New Delhi bought this system. I'm not sure yet about American cities. This is a part of a program. It's called Safe Cities. And it's really run, the main actor is an Israeli company. You like the name? Nice Systems. That's their name. And they do these kinds of, this is called combat zones that see. And they're based on all kinds of digital cameras and surveillance equipment. And And of course, the idea is that it builds a profile of every single citizen. Everybody. So, if you want to identify somebody, you don't have to go through hours and hours of tapes. You put in certain characteristics so that everybody, all of us, are a part of these systems. It's these are biodata banks. And everybody has a particular trait. Some people blink. Some people walk different. Some people have a twitch. Some people, have a scar. Everybody's got something. and these systems pick it up. So if you want to arrest somebody, or if you want to find somebody, these systems will do it really quickly. And what the NICE Systems website says, you should go into some of these websites, because somebody asked me, how did I write this book? How did I get all this information? Well, this is all on their websites. Why would you produce a system to market if people didn't know about it? Right? So more of this is out than you would imagine. And they'll say to a security state, Israel is trying to press this idea of a security state. You can have your democracy, but your security is dominant. Democracy is subordinate to security. And that gets into the whole Patriot Act direction and so on. So that in a security state, the greatest threats are states of exception, people doing unusual things, right? People of exception, people who kind of look or behave differently than the norm, and spaces of exception, especially anonymity, places where the state doesn't know what you're doing, who you're meeting with, what you're talking about. These are all considered threats to the security state, and these are the kinds of threats that these totalizing systems are intended to address. I'm trying to check out if Israel's involved in this. The scariest system, is in China today, where they're experimenting with social credit. And they've taken a whole Chinese city as an example. And I have a feeling Israel's involved. I just don't know yet. And that is that every citizen, every child gets, let's say, a credit of 10. 10 is the best citizen. All right, you go to school. So what school you go to, what grades you get bumps your credit up or down. You read books from the library. What books you read bumps your credits up or down. The job you have, the people you see, you complain to the city about garbage collection. Well, that could bump you down a notch. In other words, they compose a profile of you and determine, based on your collective social credit, you'll have access or not to certain jobs, to travel, to education. In other words, it's really the most, Orwell couldn't imagine a system that controlling. And I'm writing an article about Israel and China, in that these are the two countries with the highest, Israel with the highest level of technology, and China with the most willingness to use it, that don't have any constraints. In this country, critical as we are, you do have laws and you have structures. For example, the CIA isn't allowed to talk to the FBI, except according to certain channels. You separate military and police. There's different jurisdictions and so on. You still have, citizens, you have a right to transparency. Certain things, that doesn't exist in Israel and China, that are security states. And so they're able to develop and apply these, they're the laboratories that can move these things forward that then will come back into countries like this one. Just one example of that. Look here's the security and the surveillance industry in the world. There's 528 companies in the surveillance industry. Um, Israel has 27 of them, but the top countries, 510 of the 528 companies are in the global north. So we can begin to get a sense of who's looking at who, who's following who's controlling who, and so on. Israel specializes in drones, not just big drones, but micro drones. The Technion, which is Israel's Polytechnic University, that's been called the laboratory of the IDF, that is, by the way, a perfect target for BDS. And there's a big campaign in Canada and other countries about the Technion because it's very involved in your universities in the United States. They developed this kind of a thing that's called mimicry. In other words, you develop drones that mimic insects, right? How's this for a weapon? This is a drone the size of a mosquito. The eyes are cameras. And these are super cameras. I mean, these are like, cameras that can see for miles and heights and pick up things. And this is poisons, because this can be used, as an assassination weapon to poison someone, not just for surveillance. Well, Israel is the world's leader, or one of the world's leaders, in the military uses of nanotechnology. A nano is the size of a molecule. And you can fill a nanobot, it's called, with, for example, anthrax, which is a disease that has no antidote, or other kinds of diseases. An ampule like this size, can contain enough anthrax to kill at least 200,000 people. So this is a weapon. It's a cute little weapon, but this is really a weapon of mass destruction on almost a molecular. Or look at this weapon's on this guy's thumb. You can see how tiny it is. Or even weaponizing insects themselves. This becomes a perfect camouflage. And getting down to nano weapons. I'm not going to get into nano weapons tonight. That's a whole lecture. But these are the most dangerous weapons in the world. These are the kinds of weapons the Pentagon is most investing in. The Pentagon, Germany, China, and Israel are the major countries investing in nano weaponry that are tremendously powerful. I'll give you just a tiny example. I don't know enough about it, actually. I have trouble getting information about nano stuff. It's very technical and it's highly secret, and I've read a number of things. I have an idea, but I can't get into too much detail about it. But for example, I was in Sardinia a few months ago. And in Sardinia, there's an American military base that has a nuclear submarine in it that very much upsets the Italians. And I was on a panel with a fellow who specializes in nanotechnologies. Italy is one of the world's leaders in the medical applications of nanotechnology, biomedicine. That's where it has a good image. And Israel is one of the leading countries for the military applications of nanotechnology, and they have a joint institute called the Lutz Institute in Florence to combine their technologies. And this guy was doing that kind of research, and he said, everybody's afraid of nuclear weapons, right? The big nuclear weapons scare, and they're dangerous. But he said, you know what? You can take a nanobot, size of a molecule, roughly, and you can load it with artificial intelligence and with, let's say, a corrosive material, okay, and send it down to the bay with orders to destroy the nuclear submarine. One nanobot replicates 1 trillion times within 48 hours. So within a day, that one nanobot and its offspring will eat the entire submarine and the nuclear weapons. I mean, that's how powerful these kinds of weapons are. And we don't know anything about them. I'm interested and I don't know anything about them. And these are some of the leading weapons of the military industries. So we don't even have a clue to what the most dangerous weapons are. So there was a science conference, the Global Catastrophe Risks Survey, and they asked the scientists there, what's the probability of human extinction before the year 2100? And they said it's about a 20% likelihood that humanity will be extinct by 2100. And then they broke it down. And look, it's mainly nanotechnologies. 5% probability is from molecular nanotechnology weapons. That was on top for them. And we don't even have that concept in our discourse. Super intelligent artificial intelligence was number 2. Non-nuclear wars, engineered pandemics, which takes us back to the mosquito, and then down the list you get into nuclear wars, and then you get back into nanotechnology, a nanotechnology accident, natural pandemics, nuclear terrorism. Now, I don't know if climate change was even asked, but climate change isn't even on the list. So these are the main threats that the scientists see to global catastrophe, and they're kinds of technologies we know nothing about. And they're kinds of technologies that Israel specializes in. Because I want to get into the whole issue of pacification and policing on the local level. This is the idea of a security state that Israel is trying to push onto the world. Israel has this concept. And that is, you do securitization, like the global war on terror, so that includes everybody, right? Fought in a domestic battle space. It's not wars abroad necessarily. And for that, the police are militarized. And then Homeland Security is a way of spanning the military and police. Because the problem in the United States and Western countries is there's a firewall between internal, external, inside, outside, military, civilian, CIA, FBI. And that's very important, you see? So you have, for example, in the United States, you have the military here, you have domestic security and police over here, right? And they're very separate. There's a few cases, where there was direct military intervention by an army in a domestic situation. For example, the National Guard in Little Rock, that Eisenhower sent in. New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. The Occupy movement, which is very interesting, where the army played there are cases like that, but they're very, very rare. You go back to the 1930s for some of them. And then there are cases in the United States and other countries where police are militarized. SWAT teams are the best example. SWAT teams are militarized police. 30 years ago, there were 4 SWAT teams in the United States. You had Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. Today, 85% of American police forces have SWAT teams, including, southeastern Missouri, north central Idaho. They all have with military weapons. So you have the militarization of the police, but it's still, as you know, it's very controversial. Jewish Social Peace has a program called Deadly Exchange, which is trying to raise public consciousness about that. But this is the system in the United States and other Western countries where you have that division. In Israel, you don't have that division. When there's a stabbing at the Damascus Gate, the army is there, the border police are there, the regular police are there, the Duv Devan and Yassam units are there. Everybody comes. A lot of if you think about crime programs that you see on TV, there's a murder, and it's often around the FBI comes in and the local police resist. There's a fighting between the local police and the FBI over jurisdiction. And then, Everybody's fighting about that. That's what you have in this country, and it's a good thing. But Israel is trying to say, to have a real security state, you have to combine your militaries and domestic securities like we do. These are completely combined units. They don't fit. They fit into both. So that, and in this kind of policing, which is called high-intensity policing, the people are seen as the enemies or as terrorists, not as citizens to be protected. There's a very fundamental change here. So that's what Israel is trying to bring in. So the police are militarized. Homeland Security becomes that bridge. You see, between the military, that's what's put together, the military and the police. And then you get to a state of exception or a state of emergency that suspends civil protections, like the Patriot Act, that is much more, that keeps getting renewed. It's not even an issue anymore, but it's renewable, the Patriot Act. That leads to repressive laws and regulations that give more police power to the police. Due process is weakened. And then it gets into this globalized bureaucratic logic where everybody, immigrants, just think of Trump's rhetoric. The immigrants, the criminals, the M13, the terrorists, this and that. So the local police state of exception, insecurity gets tied into a global system, and then populations that are seen as being, exceptional or poor or threats or restive, become targeted, and then that gets into a kind of bureaucratic warfare. So the whole thing revolves around the security state and pacification. In the end, the goal is to pacify us, to make us incapable of resisting. And you see that the best example for me is the airport security. There is no need in the 21st century to take your computer out of the bag. There's no need. The Europeans have been trying to change that for years, but the Americans are insistent and won't certify their airports if they don't do it. In Europe, you don't take off your belt. You don't take off your shoes. All those things you don't have to, but, people do it automatically here. You can tell American tourists to Israel because they're the ones that are walking around without shoes. We pacify ourselves. That's kind of the point of this whole thing. And the militarized police and this change in the structure, which gets into technologies. So the Israeli weapons industry is one of Israel's companies that produces the Uzi submachine gun. Well, the Uzi is the most popular submachine gun in the world, not only with police and military, but with criminal gangs, drug cartels. The Uzi is in movies all the time. Now, the Israel weapons industry has just opened a plant in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, to supply American law enforcement officers and this huge American gut nut market, right? So what they're doing is they're taking military weapons and reducing them into weapons for law enforcement or even for civilian use. So the Uzi used to be a small submachine gun that you'd hold like this. Now it's reduced to a pistol. So the next time your local policeman stops you on the street, he could easily be pulling out an Uzi submachine gun from his holster. Here's another example of the Israel weapons industry's weaponry. This is called the X95 assault rifle. That's used by the Israeli army, but they've reduced it for you see, Israel weapons industry, they've reduced it for law enforcement here. So it's a combined assault rifle, carbine, submachine gun. So you say, well, okay, why carbine? You know what a carbine is? That's the rifle you hunt deer with. Why would you put that together with a submachine gun and an assault rifle? Because in the United States, a carbine can be sold across the counter. You can buy a carbine at Walmart's. You see? So by putting a carbine component into an assault rifle, you make it available to the greater market. So it's really an example of how weapons are being made from military into law enforcement into weaponry for the general public. All right, there's all kinds of non-lethal so-called technologies of repression as well. Israel's developed, for example, skunk, which is a kind of spray that leaves a terrible smell. So first of all, it disperses crowds, but it lasts for weeks. You can't get it off your house. You can't get it off yourself. You can wash and wash and wash and wash, and it's weeks and weeks and weeks before you can get the stench removed, to such a degree that people sometimes in demonstrations are put outside of their villages by their own families because they can't stand the stench. And of course, it makes it easy for the police to pick them up later. So these are kinds of technologies. They're not really non-lethal because if you have allergies or there's different kinds of conditions, they can kill you, but they're sold as non-lethal technologies. So in the end, what I'm trying to do with my book is something bigger than just Israel-Palestine. I'm trying to work with the left here, although that's not an easy assignment, to say if we want to go beyond the hegemony of global capitalism, corporate capitalism, what new system do we have to... I think the Occupy movement, maybe I don't live here, maybe I'm not correct, seemed to me part of the reason why the Occupy movement collapsed is it had nothing to offer in a way. I mean, it got to a point where you're talking about rent controls, you're talking about this, you're talking about that, but we don't have, on the left, a concept of a new global system. Are we talking about socialism? Are we talking about David Harvey, who's a well-known Marxist, talks about a revolutionary humanism? Life-centric hegemony has been, instead of a profit-centric hegemony, has been suggested. What is this new system that we want? And until we can begin to define that, we can fight corporate capitalism, but it's going to win because it has the weaponry and it has the political program. So I'm trying to put all this within a larger political framework, and we'll see how that goes. So that's sort of a view.